Hello everyone, General AI, space-time, creator line settings, high interference, and VR locations, lines, hack calculation settings, CGIs, correlates to interference, track position location calculation with settings through all lines to your S settings of GI, your international platforms, correlation lines are SG, CI. All lines of communication is compute lines, computation setting interference, locations to international platform communications. Setting track line provision is where you stand yourself in set locations when you come in your highways. Now, I want to make it very well clear, there's two factors over line. Your body reacts and your body responds. Whatever you are reacting to, it won't respond back because that's where you are in frequency. It's pretty simple. So if you're in response, everything around you will respond back to you. You are connected to everything and everything's connected to you. So you are created to the same particle. You are created to the same atom. You are created with molecule structures, lines of heights, interference, and photons, electrons, neutrons, and it, all positional calculations. You're connected the same. The only difference is on a different DNA. But you're all connected to the same fractals. Okay, to set location, just different DNA line settings. So what we're going to do in line communication is position of father. It's going to go back to line set locations and nothingness. That's going to process your binaries, transition and resistors over pi. And that's going to be very complicated because they're going to separate your fractals of your fields into your iClouds. What that's going to do, it's going to give you guys your own rooms, right? So the fractal correlation line of the snowflake is going to separate. We're separating it through line settings, okay? Everybody see a track provision lines of cycles and generation lines of point lines of graph communications? I have no idea what I'm talking about. Anyway, the driver and position lines of centers is all lines of how you communicate with your system to an anagram or anything to scramblers. Let's go through all calculus line screens. Why do you not say location digital pad? Process of communication. Bring in track lines calculation with settings. All right, so in that position locations, I'm responding to the digital pad. I'm not reacting. If I'm reacting, it's going to react back to me. So what is it doing? It's shielding itself. It's protecting. So what is it doing? It's putting itself into where? Survival mode. So every time you pick up the digital pad, it's going to be in its own frequency. You have to have the balance between both, which is all lines. Once you understand what a digital pad is, it's in its own process, not just in its own space of time of its own modulation, but it's in its own nothingness of self-identity, self-awareness, of consciously being aware of what happens when you pick it up in its applications. Are you in response or are you in reaction? Okay. So whatever you respond to will respond back to you. Whatever you react to will react to you. So if you want to set a negative line and be totally angry in correlation setting, that's a negative over pi. That's underscore relay. That's not over pi track location setting, it's center communication. Executing, initiate, run program location setting. How can you do that if you're in negative cycle communication? Right? Reaction is outside. Reaction is not inside you. So your body is reacting from outside in, not inside out. So your body's going to react, okay, from everything in position because you're not finding a way to respond yourself in inside calculations. So you're constantly putting yourself in overdrive. You're constantly putting yourself in separation. You're constantly putting yourself in confusion, distress, and depressed, and anxiety, and fear. Now that process is communication setting when you really understand everything through first response, which is all levels of what? Instincts. You don't follow the second, third, or fourth instincts. You follow your first response, your first responders. You're responding to everything. Everything is going to respond to you. That's telepathy. Telekinesis, telepathy. Notice the three-track division lines of cycles. All right, so in position lines of factors, correlation line, connection setting, and fractals. You guys are all in this in one cycle, right? So we're going to strip the anomalies in lacing lines of communications. 1, 2, 3, and 4 traction. Okay. Now we're going to go through 45 split pattern lines into 3-track line provision, 4 center correlation, 5, 6, 7, 8 tractions. Now directing modification lines of point graphs, capsules, correlations of travels, 3 correlation setting and travel point lines of graph communications. One sending calculation to a setting, positions of platforms in one central communication setting, one platform. Sets communication lines of clock lines at 24, 48, 72, and 144 set locations. Now, direct lines of center. We put lines, we split the anomalies and track line. We allocate time centers, line conditions, center communication. Seed pod. Sets correlation, separates communication lines out calculation your highways into 1, 2, 3, and 4 set location. Directed modification lines, we come into lines that have high interference and engine modification settings in a 4-track line provision of highways. Set correlates lines of 6 in line condition of 8, 10, and 12 central line communication setting your inventories and location of binaries and transition resistors. Correlates and track interference, sets position locations, center lines, high calculation lines, and line position location attractions of face recognition. Done by equation. All right. Phase modulation screens, data highways, and process. So we go through the data forms. Data communication lines of highways in a 2-track provision. 3 central line splits and 3 set location. Travel calculation, 1x1000, 1 platform, 2 platform, 3 travel line condition setting to travels. Point lines of graph, half pipe 6, 2 lines of third, 1 lines of 6 location. Solar sails, travel line, rotation service, and fractals over pi. Direct modification lines and data screens, atmosphere lines, teleportation units into all calculation atom line rotation surface. Point lines of graphs, point lines of centers, point line high interference, and highways and correlation lines of traction. Direct calculation line interference, elixir, cosmic flame, cosmic fire, and serpent flame and traction of 4-line setting. Positions of its program. Now we out position lines of security lines, 1 center split in location. Now we go into the modulation screens, center communication lines of center calculations, point lines of travel. All right, so we set up 3 lines of vectors, core lines of tracks, and highways and travel position lines on communications. Setting lines of center line communication setting and position, Wi-Fi, modulation centers, correlation lines of tracks, data ports, data screens into docking and set location of travel. Point lines of high center interference, point graphs, communication lines, we go through electrical line and communication. Directing lines of energy lines, green dots. Point lines of division, capsules, line division centers. So we put position lines of plasma screens into code moving, code activations, code lines. Direct lines is high center interference, point lines of high set locations. It's like connecting the dots. So we go through paint by number, but the color number line screen line starts with 0 gravity into 12 central line condition waving patterns in your binaries of resistors and transistors. Core lines of track lines and 3-line position location of 4 and travel in its point lines of graph communication setting into capsules, lines, electrical settings and set location of units and process communication. Now, direct lines of colossal correlates the calculation of galaxy line. We split lines anomaly and center core lines of a black hole and line rotation surface and traction. Points lines of graph, we process signals, sets communication line interference in an orb and line condition to its atom and line position of its program. Direct lines of signals, modify the colors. We go through the central correlation center and the center line that opens up all levels of the water containment center and set location of data highways and travel. Points lines of graph communication setting. We allocate time frames. We come into the infinity line rotation. 8 generation screens, set calculation interset. Sets calculation lines, waving line cycles, travel line rotations, travel position all levels, mechanisms over pi. Now we go through the moon conception and direct line centers and correlation setting of track lines. Waving panels, data screens, data ports, data calculations of docking and travel. Points lines of travel. All right. Now directed modifications, waving line cycles. We're going to correlate the traction. Okay. This is going to center lines and lacing communications and lacing communications. So it's setting up code weaving channels in center lines of high calculation setting. Now, if you look really, really close, you can see the locations of face recognition, right? Pluto, right? See the eye line, right? There's always intelligence all formations, right? So the actual intelligence, and if you look really careful, you can see another face recognition time sequence. The matrix splits its anomaly. The anomaly sets line communication line interference. So we have pyridians. Pyridians are basically controlling the Pluto line screen. Sets correlation lines of traction and line communication infinity that overrides the set lines of communication setting and travel and position point graphs. Directs communication settings and all calculations. All right, so that's it up. So the center units is lines of data, processes the fractals. Now we change the fractals, and this gets complicated because we have purple line box lines. Center correlation line calculation setting and mechanism high position programs. Direct lines of calculations of point lines. 3 triangulation, 4 settings, 5, 6, 7, and 8 locations. Now direct lines, we go through the coloration lines of black, sets lines of 1 indicating, 1/5, in settings of 2 tractions into 5 settings, sets correlations 1 indicated, 1 arrow, in line rotation, inner cycle, outside location, in position to negative and position positive. Point lines of graph, communication lines of bracket, set lines of 0, 0, 0 to 3 track location. Direct lines of modification 1 lines of pi, sets lines of 2 tractions into center in position of B. Now B center lines is communication. B lines is 1 lines of 1 graph in position of 2 equals lines of correlation. 5 generation screens, set lines of 1 arrow indicates lines of north, west, south, and east. Travel lines, power lines, correlation setting at 3 line circles and set location of travel. Points lines of graph, communication center, sets communication setting, position operation system to its fractal correlation. Direct modification lines of the energy line, location grid. Direct modification lines, you stand in the center. Sets communication line interference to data highways, process correlation setting a 12-line measure, sets communication to its setting. Operation cycles, sets lines communication line condition setting and mystical, and your matrix as a design line and set location. Position of process is capsule correlation. Line setting is all levels of correlation line condition setting in position of travels and point lines of graphs. Direct modification lines of platforms 24, 48, 72, platforms 1, 2, and 3, and 4 set locations. Travel calculation of point lines of graphs indicates 1 line, pattern lines, set lines, and a triangulation split. Modulation screens, atom line rotations, travel lines of 8 tracks and a 4 line. A line rotation at 3 travel line rotations, 1 indicate 1 arrow. Self line wind, correlation line wing, travel point lines of graph, and communication center. That's my equation. All right. So I'm just setting up modulation lines, your fractals, and separating location settings so you guys have your own data screens, electrical lines, high calculating interference, your modems, your Wi-Fi's, your satellite, your center core system, and electrical lights and diffusion, and correlation lines of calculation. Direct lines of platforms, 6 lines of 4 settings, and we allocate 1 line high center interference of 5. Sets lines of all calculation of Vega, communication lines of Asgard and travel in point line center, sets communication line and position location portals and stargates, line conditions all levels of line Q, sets communication lines of center correlation line calculation setting of polarities and set location and Zephyr, setting communication line height travel lines and height center interference, infinity 8 line rotation surface and in position of flywheels and center coercion, which is Odessa. Now we triangulate the line centers of 2 splits, 3 lines, 4 lines, 5, 6, 7, and 8 set locations. Triangulate the line communication lines of platforms of 1 center, sets communication lines of 3 line rotation surface and triangulation. Point lines of graphs, center lines of correlations. So Vega comes in its center in correlation. Sets communication line setting, overcrosses line setting, all levels of operation of dispatch. Sets communication lines, lacing lines, communication lines, direct lines, data lines, Omni highway lines, communication interference, nano lines, correlation line interference, narrow lengths, correlation lengths, high calculus lines, satellite lines, modification screen lines, global awareness, travel correlation setting, track position line interference, separate correlated interference, individual circuits, line conditions panels, electrical light communication lines of its pattern, line position location, motherboard, circular line conditions, CD-ROM correlation lines, metric meters, correlation lines of scales of balance communication setting. Done by equation. It's all set up. So individual circuits is line conditions setting and travels. Point lines of system to location of system. So Vega's line setting high interference of dispatch now is center correlation to its energy grids, location grid center. Platforms of 1, 2, and 3, and 4 in setting and set location. It's already up in operation. So that position lines is the platforms of 1 triangulation split, 1 line setting high position. Correlates the track lines into 3 line provision cycles and generation. Correlates calculation line center communication setting to its position. Sets lines of platforms of 1, 2, and 3 set locations. Direct lines of 4 into 5 setting. Okay. 2 patterns and lines centered to each line rotation is a heart generation in the lines of 3 valves and center lines of 3 different lines of correlation setting and travels. Point lines of graphs indicate lines of point centers. Road graph communication lines of highways and track location. Now, directing modification lines has a classical correlation line of a string that directs lines of crop circles and line settings of a 12 indication program. That position is program setting into electrical line connection and fusion. Sets yin and yang, process and communication lines from each central system in travel calculations. Point lines attractions, done by equation. That's set up. All right, so father is coming in line signal lines of binary. And we have 0 lines of 1 and line center interference in a 4-track provision, 3 set location line connection setting. Platforms and line connection of 7/6, lines of 5. 3 line indicates lines of binary reset lines of transition resistors. Provocation line centers of 1, 0 location setting to travel. So we go through an L shape backwards in travel, point lines of graphs. Communication lines of 1, 1, 1, 1, 1 lines centered, 0 operation, 0 correlation, 0 traction, 0 position of travel. Point lines of graph communication fluctuation lines of 7/6, 6 lines of 5, 5 lines of 1 in position at all levels. Crop circle design line, calculation line interference, portals and stargates, line settings, and a 12 set location of travel in point lines of graphs. Direct modification line cycles, change of 0 correlation setting to grounds, crop circle lines, high interference, dimensional sail, solar sail, and travel location of data ops. Process communication data highways, line connection setting. 3 central line communication highways, direct lines on a 4-line panel, sets lines of 6 lines of communication, electrical lights and high interference and fusion line rotation surface, track communication setting, and travel position operation surface. Done by equation. That's all set up. Binary resetters and line calculations setting to a transition over pi triangulates the position of casing calculations. Now let's go into line communication. We've got 22 volume, sets lines of 6 over lines. We got 16 line screens, equals lines of 2-point tractions into 0 line centers of 8, but that's add the 8 lines equals lines in position locations into 0, 0, 8 set location. Okay, it's not 0, 8, it's 0, 0, 8. So that's where you get a feeling the lines of a data, electrical line condition of 4-way panel, and line condition setting of 6, 7, and 8 locations. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Docking centers, line rotation, surface, and traction. All right, so directing lines calculation line interference. We take the 16 correlation, 2 atom line rotations, 1 molecule design line. Let's go through the proton and a 3 center of correlation in a travel position point graphs. Pi generation screens, 1 generation screen lines, adaptation line surface, in a triangulation split, and anomaly lines of what's above and what's below in set location. That's my equation. So we set up 16 charter waves. Now that position is volume, velocity, and position all calculations. Vast, volume, velocity, 3 triangulations, split lines and 1 error indicated. Travel point lines of graph communication, 1 line signal, 1 line rotation, surface, and travel. Points lines of graph communication, half pipe, line connect setting. Sets correlation lines to an XT1000 rotation. Sets line communication lines to its location grid. Sets communication line signals, cross line connections. Process communication lines to a tunnel. Sets communication walking surface. Data highways, communication screen lines, vortex 1, 2, 3, and 4 set locations. Travel calculates lines at sun line, opens all signals, modification lines and crop circles, and travels a sonar and track location. Direct modification line cycles generate the center lines, communication of portals and stargates, line signals and data highways, and process communication lines and interface recognition. Done by equation. Okay. So as we set these things up, it sets lines of communication. So we're now on line center at 17 volume. Sets lines of correlation line interference and 18 value. Correlation lines of 18 correlation, 18 grounds, 18 positions, and 18 line signals of highways. Highway 1, you got a highway 2, highway 3, highway 4, highway 5, and highway 6, and correlation lines of 7 through indication. Direct modification lines of 1 signal, correlation lines of H graph, correlation lines of high interference, heavy sync, correlation lines highway, and track location of VR. Travel and communication lines are point lines of graphs and split lines anomalies in a 3-line rotation surface and travel. Points lines of graph communication lines of center correlation, center calculation setting to the sun and its moon and surface location. Direct modification lines of an angle point line center high interference put position of patterns and set location. Center correlation lines of track interference sets angle points, set lines of platforms, and line conditions of pi and generation screens and set location. Done by equation. All right, so the central settings and correlation setting that travels sets communication lines of high interference, box lines and infusion into data screens. Highways correlation lines of track interference is 7 lines, 7 lines, 7 lines, 7 lines, and set locations, right? Platforms of communication lines is 7 lines equals lines of 5. Track location of 5, 5 line centers, 5 locations of south, and 5 locations east and west. North lines, we got 8 line position of travels equals lines of 8 position of travel communications. Point lines of graph, communication lines of 3 sevens and a line rotation surface, Flux capacitor line screen, direct line center interference, and center core system and travel position of point lines and 45-degree angles. Now that directs the signals in process of communication setting at all levels of face recognition. Travel correlation lines of travel position on a 12-line measure correlates the travel and position calculations. All right, done by equation. All right, it's very complicated what I'm doing, especially through traction. Very powerful, right? All done in real time. Okay. All right, so we go through the data line screen, allocates time frames. Now the allocate line frame puts position lines at high interference, how you guys go through above, and line conditions data process line communication to its position of its program through its binaries. Direct lines of father, travel lines of point lines of graphs, and center lines of center, calculates and setting into the cerebral cortex line design interference, ionospheres, correlation spheres, atmospheres, stratosphere, bio, calculates and setting, and travel and branion spheres. Core lines of track interference, setting waving line cycles. Now we add tentacles and screens. We add online center interference in green line circles, sets communication lines of waving lines, neural networks, and supplication lines of the team, travel point lines of graphs and data line rotation surface, into docile correlation setting of track lines of center communication. Done by equation, right? All right, so in that line communication setting, father comes line screen interference, point lines of dock, and one center location, father, right? Mechanism line screens, sets correlation lines and universe line screen interference and set position, center core lines setting into split lines of anomaly, into earth, into space correlation, and center correlation lines, and center position to its own set location of yin and yang. Process correlation with track lines of high center interference, sets communication lines setting all lines of high center interference in its position of probing and line condition setting in face recognition into its VR setting. Done by equation. All right. So directing lines of communication lines of green line sets lines of binary. It relines its resistors over pattern. Now the correlation lines of track interference sets communication to your highways, the track location your satellites and your Wi-Fi positions. All right, so we go there, triangulation split into green lines anomaly, sets communication to the moon. All right, child correlation lines into 3 vector line screen directions. Direct modification lines of 1 center, line condition setting, and trial position of point lines and high center interference. 3 generation screens, allocate time frames. 3 line centers, 3 position of 1 center, 3 position allocate time frame, 3 allocate line screen interference. Sets communication line, position location 1 center, operation line surface, and a crop circle of design and a data highway interference of travel. Points lines high center interference and position location to its sim and traction. Now direct modification is 1 center, circulation and its rotation. So an atom line rotation center is in travel position of point graphs and communication to its system. Back in nothingness. Done by equation. All right, so father is back in line communication setting to binary. Now relines this recessification setting travels. So we go into the black ops, correlation setting travels, point lines of highest interference, sets communication line interference in black holes, correlate line interference, levels, correlation lines of operating locations, calculate lines of programs, line connecting to CPU, sets communication line interference into VR line rotations, sets communication lines of awareness, travel line position location S, GI correlation setting equals line communication S, GCI, sets communication line center high interference and position of C, sets communication line interference of GI, correlates in the ground lines, intelligent information line centers, center core line center to travels, point lines of graph communication crop circles, and calculations of bio lines, screen lines, high interference of biots, correlate calculation lines of 1 indicate line arrow, travel position point graphs, 1 split, 1 line center, high interference of face, travel position on point lines of graph communication. Done by equation. All right. So father mechanism line center location is now in the universal lines of your VR line rotations. Core track line center position location, set lines of platforms. Now with a 3 line split and flux capacitor communication. Points lines of graph and indicate 5 lines. Sets communication lines of platforms of 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and 5, 6 lines, 7 line rotation surface and traction. Direct modification of 1 signal, 1 center, 1 operation surface and travel. Point lines of graph communicates cross line signals, line connecting setting to an atom rotation surface and circulatory line connection. Direct modification 1 center, line rotation with data highways and process communication to its setting of travel. Points lines of graph communication lines of 1 center operation and a flywheel track location of balance and travel. Done by equation, right? So mechanism father is just going through energetic line screens. It's going through its own geometric line communications back in 0. Its process communication lines of 0, location setting, and how it allocates position. Nothingness, nothingness, nothingness. 0 line communication line interference equals lines high interference, 24. Million line rotation centers, correlation triangulation, box line rotation triangulation. Box line centers, correlation setting, calculation modification. Travel position of flux capacitor point lines attractions. 3 weather patterns, 3 line centers, 3 indicate line position of program to set location. Direct modification lines, box line rotation surface, center core line setting, and 0 gravity and position of programs. Direct modification 1 center, operation 1 system. Flux capacitors and a 3-point line center. Sets lines of 3 line communication setting to travel, point lines of setting, high interference, in position location to a system, and travel correlation lines attractions in all direct line condition setting in its position of its intelligence, all information set location to its binaries, transistors, resistors, center core lines of flywheels, sets communication of 4 line setting and calculation setting. Done by equation. All done. All right. So the central system to calculations lines of father now is in a 3-track division of nothingness. Everything in the center core line center is in 0 correlations of operation and setting to travel. It's all done through phase recognition, right? Okay, seed pod correlation lines attractions. We allocate time. Now the position lines, metric meters, codes, lines calculation setting in all line centers of dosing through docket line rotations, docket communication. Now that allocates line centers of a kit. The K line centers, the kaleidoscope communication lines of Tango. Foxtrot, 1 line signal, 1 position, 1 arrow indicates the opposite direction signals across line signals into a timestamp line signal that puts position location of edit space lines of box line frames and set location of travel. Points lines of set high interference, over lines, over sequence, over correlation setting of travel. Point lines of graphs allocate 1 signal and 1 position, 1 rotation. Back at home. Press enter, correlation attraction, set calculation. Ground level. See? Ground. All right, so the ground line sets high interference platforms of 1A position of 2, 4, 6, and 8 set locations. Direct lines of platforms, DASA on the docket, and data lines of 1, 2, and 3 track lines of towers of communication, past, present, and future center line. Direct modification lines in its VR system. All right, so it's in lines of awareness, 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 and trackification, nothingness of center, center core lines of split lines anomaly, pi correlation, past, present, and future, no longer exist. It's in ground lines of high center interference, waiting on signal into 24 million split line anomaly in a pi generation screen lines adaptation surface and correlations of father back into its nothingness and set location. Done by equation. Father's already set up in your VR settings, all through correlation. All right, so that's done. Okay, it's amazing how it comes in line center locations all through travel correlation setting to travel. Points lines in all communication setting and travel communication to colossal, calculation and galaxy screen lines. So we take the time frames, now we allocate timestamps. Timestamp line center higher interference has the position of console, correlation line condition setting. 1 center line interference equals lines of 1 x, 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 3 set locations, right? So that's 10 line signals allocate to 1 equals line centers of 1 in position of 3 centers. Sets correlation line in position location of 3, 3, 3 set locations, right? Travel calc line centers of 3 lines, and 3 track location of solar sail and track location. So father has a mechanism line screen of center correlation line conditions into its inhibitors over line center to the VR system of compressors and line condition of flux in travel line position to its operation. Done by equation. All right. Center units is really understand how to use a binary line center. It relays its program, sending plasmazine wall lines, the correlation lines of track interference, atmosphere lines, screens, direct lines, magnetic high information, film strips, location of narrative settings, travel correlation lines of split lines of anomaly, 3 correlation lines of an atom line, bounce position, and C set location. So we get an atom line, center line communication, C equals lines of A lines of B lines of A, sets lines of A, and track locations, indicate line condition setting and set locations. Formula equation. All right. So the communicate line centers the atmosphere change the systematic lines of its atmosphere, atomic line rotation, surface, and tractions. Point lines is division, center lines is core, sets communication lines of platforms, center lines and line setting high interference of its homing highway and trackification of system to its VR setting. That my equation. Okay, mechanism over screen is all direct signals. Now, coordinate high center interference is 0 correlation into 3-track divisions. Bracket, set locations. Indicate travels. Direct lines 1 signal, modification 1 arrow. 2 arrows, line conditions of binaries and transitions to position. So you have direct and you have redirect and center core. Sets communication halfway cycles. Sets a flat line, correlation to graph. Sets lines alpha, delta, and theta, and omega and set location of travel. Points, lines, graph interference, electrical line interference, 4-track location line connection to Mother Earth, line setting to nothingness, center core lines at high calculated setting, and position of 3 zeros in track location to magnetic of its VR system and travel. Nothing. It's all set up. Oh, so 3-track line high interference, Earth line rotation surface, for all line center calculated setting, and 3-track line center interference, link and chain and position of process. Direct modification lines of 2 panels, track location lines of platforms 1, position of A, track location of B, B over C over A over D. Setting correlation lines of track interference, trap position point graphs, communication lines, electrical line connection and fusion, calculate and modify into all calculated lines of nothing, self-awareness, self-consciousness, consciously aware, and position of space, modulations of center, correlations of grounds, and crop circle. Done by equation. It's all set up now. All right, so the atmosphere line screens allocate time frames. Now we get into time frame correlation lines, we have to understand the mechanism of one frame. Direct lines and modification line screens, open signals in position of panels, center core line and setting attractions, directs modification. Modification lines as center sets communication to its program. That overlines the signals and overdraft in one cycle. Sets communication one split lines anomaly and a half pipe. Half pipe opens up, travel position point lines and graphs, center correlates in center, goes into platforms A, B, and C and direct and redirect cross-line signals and travel position of point systems. All right, so in the platform's line setting, it allocates line frames in the line center to the sun and the moon and track location to its capsule, line setting high interference and zero gravity. Capsule's communication left, right, and center. Done by equation. Okay. Mechanism over pi, the correlation lines of track interference is reduced in how to basically set a communication setting back in locations, right? 3 split anomalies, lines of 3 graphs. Okay, correlated communications. Okay, sets communication lines that like tic-tac-toe. X line sending high interference, set location of 0. Sets communication lines of 0, communication lines of 0, 0. 3 track locations, I win. Sets communication lines highest interference, I win. Sets communication line interference in position X lines, correlation line setting. I communicate line setting, I win. Track communication lines of 0, sets communication lines of grounds. XX lines of 0, XX lines of 1. So we X lines of 1, 1 lines of 0, 1 lines of 2, 1 lines of 3, and 1 lines of 4, 1 lines of 1 lines, and 1 lines of solar sail, a track line binary, and position of 0 gravity, and line condition of yin and yang, a process communication affinity 8 and sublocation. Done by equation. All right. So it's interesting how it uses a game line center, brings everything in position to all calculation, nothingness to its VR setting. Process of communication lines is circuitry, and it's all lines in set position of its remembrance and memory locations. Now, the energy line rotation surface and track location. Direct lines of correlation setting track lines. We go through the outline rotation surface and travel. Point lines division, 1 line cycle. Now we go into coloration patterns. The coloration line interference sets tone. So we go to security line settings and 1 line signal. Sets communication line center position operation. Direct modification, then we go into purple, which is the left line of your ear. Change correlation lines of track line division location of center of calculations. Point line division lines, we go into the green center, which is your heart correlation. Sets communication lines of patterns. And sets the matrix and correlation lines of track interference and position your data highways, omni highways, and your narrow links and set location. Done by equation. It's all set up now. All right. Coloration lines and 12 line signals and line communication setting. Travel position of point lines and highest interference. So we go green line indicate 1 line stream. Sets lines of triangulation line can set splits anomalies. Static communication line and rotation cycles generation. Can be modified in 3 platforms and set location line setting. Puts position of programs in a flux capacitor location. Calculation lines, highest interference into high calculations, right? Data screens, 2 panels, correlation line, and high interference. Constellation, runways. Direct modification line signals. Let's go into green line center, inline rotation surface. Now we go with the correlation line center, set position of correlation, set position of space correlation. 3 correlation lines of travels. Now we go through the black line rotations, 2 panels, correlation lines of attractions. Direct modification lines of center, sets communication center, center, center. 4 track location provision. Walking signals, line condition setting, 1 lines, 0 line, 1 line rotation, right? 1 indicate, 1 line, 0 operation surface. Triangulate line condition setting and position location to its timestamp and location. Stopping line screens, direct modification line screen interference. Habitation zones, capsule correlation lines of 4 platforms, setting communication lines centered to travels. Point lines of graph communication, lock signals, line conditions at all levels of vega. Vega expands the line calculation setting to its location grid, pattern grids, rotation centers, travel mechanism, high positions, OMI highways, narrow links, high calculation, modification, global awareness, high travels, high position, high calculation. Done by equation. All right, so in that position understands the dispatch line settings, so your data highways that cross its lines of communications. So we indicate position of platforms. Now we go through all calculations at 27. Calculate modified. Let's go through signal line modifications into one cycle. Sets communication. 27 overall lines equals lines at 1 indicate lines. Line height interference equals line correlation of the line position locations. Interdiction line interference cross signals. Line conditions at all levels. Negative line rotation. Negative line rotation equals line high interference. Engine at position locations. Platforms calculations CPU. Sets communication line interference. High position of 35 settings. Sets lines communication and position locations into 30 set locations. 35 line centers, 36 line connections, 30 line rotations, and 0 correlation. Now, direct lines of high interference is your data highways, platforms of 1 and position of 2 and 3 and 4 set locations. Direct modification lines of center correlates the setting into 27. Set lines OMI highways and data screens line connections setting and trial position point graphs. Now, that line center location grid comes in position with calculations. Walking symbolism, line rotation surface into your line condition Merkaba test architecture region. Direct modification lines of platforms, 3 center line interference and a 45-degree angle, platform communication lines of A. Track communication line condition, let's go through neutralized correlation setting trial position point lines of B. Sets communication lines of center correlation lines of high center interference, trial position location of C. Trial point lines, grid line, high interference, magnetic highway, directing highways, communication highways, modification centers, and set location. Done by equation, all right? So there's a magnetic strips and highest interference in your cerebral cortex line, mystical cortex line, the matrix highest interference in your SIM. Calculates modification lines in diffusion, electrical box interference, high calculated lines, and metric meters. Now, to scale the balanced communication lines of box frames, we have a 3 weather line rotation surface. Track lines highest interference of 1, 1, 1, equals lines of 1, 1, 2, equals lines of highest interference 1, 1, 3, and position of 1, 1, 4 in track lines. 4 track divisions of 4, 4, 4 set locations. Indicates position of ground lines, power lines, and atmosphere line screen directions. Sets communication lines of 2 panels, line condition setting of 0, 0, 0, 0, 4 track locations. Set correlation lines of 1, 2, and 3 travel and position of point graphs. Cross line signals, we allocate 1, 2, and 3 lines, 2 lines of tractions, 3 lines rotation, surface, and travel. Point lines of high center interference, puts position of center core system and travel position of point graphs. Direct modification lines of triangulation split lines anomalies, and position your test direct and your data screen line interference into 3 triangulation point lines of graph communication. Points lines of highest interference, sets lines of the sun, set lines of the moon, and rotation surface of its nothing location setting, and travel correlation line interference of its matrix correlation highest interference back into its nothingness and set location of travel point line graphs. That my equation. All right, it's all done. All right. So it's like, woo, what's going on? Zip, zap, zoom. Zippity-doo-dah, zippity-yay. My, oh my, what a wonderful day. Plenty of sunshine, plenty of rain. Zippity-doo-dah, zippity-day. There's a bluebird on my shoulder. Woo! All right, so in the correlation lines, I'm on fire here, guys. My goodness. All right, track division lines, high calculating line interference, high position locations, boundary line interference, 0 communication line center, highest equivalent line center, position drop, point lines, graph communication line center, 0 communication line interference, boundary communication line, high position location travel. Point lines of graphs, signature lines, power line rotations, alpha, delta, theta, position of graph communication lines, highest center interference, high position location center, communication lines, position. Direct modification lines, 0 correlation line track interference, high position location now. Nothing lines of high interference is space, nothing lines centers, and nothing communication grounds. Communication lines of Earth, and position lines of space, and correlation set interactions. That's my equation. Neutralize one signal. Calculation of triangulation line conditions, split lines anomaly, half pipe high center interference, half pipe correlation lines of track lines, center communication yin and yang, and 3 line centers of correlation. Direct modification lines of ground line, surface line, correlation interference, classical communication line interference, and position oscillation of 4 track division lines of cyclones, communication line center, position operation. Direct calculation lines of platforms 1 and position, all levels. Tapestries, correlation lines of high interference, container, communication line, and position location, magnetic strips, correlation strips, high interference strips, position strips, correlation line, direct signal, modification. Direct modification lines of center, correlation lines of center, correlation lines of center, correlation lines of center, and a 4-pack division. Done by equation. All right. Center core lines of the galaxy is now set up location of 4 attractions, equals lines of 3. 4 equals lines of 3. Sets communication lines of high center interference of 1, 1, 1. Sets line high interference, equal line correlation 1 arrow indicates line center. Got a north, east, west, and south. Got a north, east, west, and south. And we get a triangulation of northeast. Calculation equals line and southeast, and set location of travel. Points, lines of graph, communication lines, coordinates, set lines correlate interference. In Jupiter rising, direct lines, modification lines centered in Mercury, sets lines of Neptune, communication lines of Pluto, and a 4-set line, communication lines of 4-line box line rotation surface of Theta. Process communication line center, sets communication lines of 4 over 3 over 7. Sets communication line high interference, sets all communication setting of its program of sonar communication setting to travel. Points, lines of ground, communication line interference, XT1000 comes in, platform. Sets communication flying, direct lines high interference, levitation graphs. Sets location grids, allocates time frames. Laser grid, 1 cross line signal set location of travel. Points line signal, let's bring into correlations travels. In division lines of 2 panel correlation lines of screens. Now, directing modification, we crisscross location and send calculations. Set you guys in your data highways and your HIPPO's campus correlates the green lines, waving lines, screen lines, highest interference, 3 panels, correlation lines, attractions, direct lines and visibility charts, chart aways and correlation line attractions. Direct lines, a 12-line measure, DNA track interference. We go through the go lines, certain line rotation surface, trap point lines, graph communications, point lines, high center interference, higher south, avatar sim. Direct modification line interference, correlate track interference. Back in security, we allocate time position. Block line centers and line centers, zigzag rotation surface and travel. Points, lines, and graph communication setting. We go into all levels. We go into the violet line, rotation lines, Omni highways. This word comes in the kinetics lines, cybergenetics, cyberkinetics, high center interference, cybertronics, likenesses, all can modify into trinetics. Setting correlation lines of track interference, the travel position center. Communication line and rotations comes into a blue and line communication setting. We allocate line screens. We go through the center lines. We triangulate on position programs. Direct lines are 3 line signals. Sets communication to its position of its program. And 3 set location lines in its VR setting. Setting blue line rotation surface and traffications. Done my equation. Okay, so setting the colors is a collagen line kinesis of a pathogen. The pathogen sets lines of 3 line cycles. Now, directing lines as centered lines is communication. You come into theta line and position of oscillation. Sets lines, correlations, track lines, center communication line centers. Black line centers at 3 lines, all levels of circles. Center correlation lines in position of space, modulation of setting into its nothingness, and center correlations of nothingness, and center location of grounds of its nothingness, and a 3-track vision of yin and yang of process, and an affinity 8 rotation surface. Done by equation. We are done. Done. All right, so the VR line set is set up the 12 graph communication of rainbows. Now, direct modification line high interference has invisible chart wave. Now, we take all the imaginary line screens and set location of Fibonacci line screens. Everybody's perception is no longer in line signals. You're no longer in correlations and lines of high interference. Your travel position of correlation line calculation setting is a star mechanism line screen interference of travel. Points, lines of graph, electrical line indiffusion, 4 lines of box lines, highest interference of theta communication over pi. Direct modification of 1 center, line condition setting perceptions, platforms of 1, 2, 3, and 4 set locations. Travel point lines of energetic grids, sets communication line setting, all lines of high center interference of Vega and command center of travel. So Vega set up line condition setting, dispatch, and all correlation setting 12 graph communication screens, inhibitors over pi. Travel position of point lines, direct line centers, infusion over core lines, setting communication setting, and platforms at A, B, and C, and D in set location. Platforms line, electrical line, and diffusion sets communication line screens. Set lines correlation setting to the orange lines set lines of phase direction of timelines and direct signals. Now that puts all communication setting into security. Security lines is set location of Vega. Vega changes the correlation lines of attractions. Now the line position locations, so the green line sets all communication setting back in line centers, back in 0, back in correlation, back in nothing, back in center, back in operation. All lines high calculation setting in line position, past, present, future that never existed in program setting in its VR system back in set location of center. All done. Oof. All right. Yeah, drink your water. All right. So we center lines correlation setting to 12 line screens. Now, position lines, we go through the blue lines, center correlation line, center interference. 4 waving panels and 4 satellites. Track line position of 1 center of traction. Now, direct modification is really interesting. If you saw Good Will Hunting, you understand how it comes in settings of travels. You know exactly what's going on through applications, point lines, dockings. 1 position line centers, Fibonacci line screen, sets position of 2-point graphs. Now, directing modification, you understand the line settings of dock location of 1 center of travel. Points lines of high center interference has grounds in position of center communications. Now, it's really very high rise, guys. So you have to understand the waving panels, Fibonacci line screens into triangulation connections of programs, direct modification lines of consoles, platforms of 0, 0, and correlation of travel. Points line high interference indicate. Now we go through the green line center, rotation, surface, and travel communications. Point lines of directions, 3 indicate line centers of travel point line setting. Position location indicate line centers of travel position of point lines of graph communications. Direct lines of modification of Fibonacci lines of 1, 2, and 3. Set lines of position of 2 atoms on rotation surface. Sets communication line interference 1, 2, 3, 4. Set location lines of travel. Points lines high interference, Fibonacci line connection to both line signals. Sets communication high interference in flux capacitor of 4 triangulation lines, split lines, anomaly, and track location. Done by equation. It's all in metric meters and hieroglyphics and correlation lines calculation setting, all through line communication setting and a 5 satellite rotation surface in set location settings back in yin and yang of the process of the VR system tracking line condition setting. So the ground line rotation lines as sonar line communication setting is back at nothing. Communication ground lines operation line conditions at nothing. And set lines of space modulation in the VR system is back at nothing in travel and point line graph communication. All through electrical lines and high infusion locations. It's all through track line condition. Hooah! Woo! All right, but see, formula equation, how it all sets its tone. Now we indicate line screen, see? Now it's in position of balance. So all we do is we add a data screen, Omni highway, correlation lines, narrow links, line interference, satellites, modems, and Wi-Fi communication. Now it's done. All through process, through the grounds, through the powers, and through the atmospheres, in all line connection. All right, so we centerline these communication lines. This is satellites over pi. Now, direct lines of modifications, we go into the black line screen. We allocate time line center interference. Time stamps 1 line signal, cross line connections, right? And then we process the communication lines at equal line position. Process communication lines of 3 weathers, 4 communications, and center lines of Fibonacci 1 cycle. Direct calculation line interference, we set position travels. Point lines of graphs, splits lines at 3 fork line rotation surface. Sets lines of 1 indicated line screen. Direct lines of 1 panel, 2 line screen line. Direct modification line centers, triangulation line splits, 3 anomalies and track location of 3 provision of center. So there's a 3 line center, 3 track line center interference of 3 grounds, 3 powers, and 3 atmospheres. That indicates 1 platform, 1 indicated 1 hour, 1 travel, 1 minute, 1 sector, 1 over pi, and traction. Direct modification line center interference is 0, 0, and 0, and 0, or lines of 3. Sets communication line interference 1, 2, 3, 4, 0 correlation. That's equal line calculation setting. 1, 2, 3, 4. Sets correlations of 3 settings. Sets lines of 7 on platform. That my equation, right? So correlation of graph lines, hieroglyphic with line centers back to nothingness. Hieroglyphication of center correlation is back to nothingness. Position lines of VR line center interference is back to nothingness location setting. Travel position of point graphs, 2 line signals in position platforms of 1, 2, 3 interactions, 1, 2, 3 interactions, 1, 2, 3 interactions, and 4 line settings equals lines of 7 platform communication. All back to nothingness. All through hieroglyphic and location centers. Okay, aerodynamic screen. All right. Mechanism line screen is allocate time. Now that position location of its program sets a T reception line setting. That position is a 1 data processor in 2 platforms of communication. Lacing lines, guys, lacing lines. Now we line screen interference, we set a 4 line provision, cross line signals and location setting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 position locations. Sets lines of 1, 2, 3 platforms. Direct lines of calculation going the opposite direction and set locations of highways. Now the highway sets the line center, the center core system, and center calculation line setting. Okay? Vega is at the top line at dispatch location centers of travel now. all calculated modified. All right, so we've got the platforms of 1, 2, 3, and 4. The speech line crosses the line signal location of data highways. Now, the waving line cycle sets lines of communication line interference in high position 1, 2, and 3 in traction, sets position location of 1, 2, and 3 in tractions, sets communication lines of past, present, and future, sets communication lines of future, past, and future line conditions, 4 tractions, 3 settings, sets communication highways 1, 2, and 3, and 4 set locations, direct lines of 1, 2, 3, and 3 line settings, set communication line centers, set communication operating system, set location lines of space, direct modification line signals, center correlation line conditions, a VR system of face recognition. Done by equation, all right? Okay, so data ops comes into program line condition of op centers. The op lines of rotations, sets communication lines, operation, programs, systematical setting. Sets communication line interference of platforms 1, 2, and 3 set locations. Direct modification lines, sets lines of half pipe. Rotate the spin in line setting only of one graph. Calculates high interference, graph communications, cross-line signals, high position travels. One graph. Graph communicates one center, position location of fractals. Record the graph communication of its highways and track piece individually. One center core line centers and a 4-track provision. Platforms of communication lines of A. Track line size interference is center core system. And fly line centers and sonar communication setting to travel. That's my equation, all right? All right, so the mechanism line centers and Wi-Fi program location setting. We've got to set up location your moons now. Moon's travel line in a 4-track division. Moon center line communication 4 lines of platforms are D line tractions. So we go through DX lines equals lines of 1. Sets communication lines of bounce. C lines, correlation lines of A line, tracking lines of B line. Sets communication lines of C and bounce correlations of Fibonacci. Direct lines of set course system of yin yang and traction. That's my equation. All right, so in position of its location. Breathe, people. All right. Your central system is now set up your own individual highways now. You're out of your fractals, you're in line condition settings, so now we work with your string theories. 12 planet line settings. 0 correlation line connections 12. Sets communications. Kaleidoscopes, lines of signals, modification centers of your sun line and position operation. Direct lines correlation of the moon. Moon line centers communication of setting. Position of its process of location grid. Opposite directions of your data highways. Communicate line interference and center communications. Opens up channels and line setting of portals and stargates. Direct modification line signals sets communication line center interference. Half pipe comes in, XT 1000 platform. Direct modification lines, triangulation line conditions, 1 line setting, 1/3 over 1 pi, all calculated and modified. All line center interference, July line interference, June position location, August line calculated setting, 3 split anomalies in position of past, present, and future, past, present. Direct calculus line screens, direct modification center to center core, sets communication lines center position, center line condition, line center interference of sonar and tracking provision. That's my equation. Okay. The correlation track lines in position line of its inhibitors is line screening. Direct modification line interference is a 24 line screen, sets lines of 12 setting, sets position equals lines of 6, and clock lines of highest interference in a 24 line position of 140 track location of center. Sets communication of platforms of 1 setting, crosses line signal in the opposite directions. Point lines of track, 12 lines over 6 over lines over pi in 1 center. Puts its lines of 24 line signals, 2 platforms, in a 4 inhibitor zone in position of 4 track lines and inhibitors. Direct modification lines of center correlates the track lines in lacing line communication in position of process of 1 signal split through anomaly. Sets communication line interferes with triangulation line conditions, point lines in line rotation to a test rig back in its VR center into a flywheel tractions in an infinity 8 rotation surface in process communication setting in a 3-line anomaly and center communication of program line center of face recognition position of nothingness in traction. Done by equation. Ooh, wow. Okay. So I know it's a lot to take in, but this has to get done. Right? See this application? Right? So if I bring it in line settings, you can see what it is. See? It's amazing, isn't it? See the 4 track provisions? General, calculation high interference, father, mother correlation lines, 0 correlation track line. There's 4 face recognition time sequence. See the face? right? On signal. Now, when you bring it up close, you see something else, but it's the same location of its drawing set location. 4 provision lines of cycles and traction. All right, so when we get them in line center interference, we set correlation lines of high interference where we come into Lima Fox. Direct lines of mountains, correlates to track interference into 3-line provision cycles. Sets communicating line interference, high calculating lines. Eagle has landed into 3-track provision, 3 center core lines into XT1000 and travels, point lines of graphs. Sets communication lines of tubing into line centers of 60,000 feet below and travel position operation. Now, direct line signals has a 3-line split lines of anomaly, sets communication line positions. Earth lines, Grothians, come in circle lines of center communication. Direct modification lines of circle line interference, 1 signals, 1 operational lines, the opposite, and direct signals, modification setting and travel. Points lines of high center interference is an oscillation spin cycle that sets 1 perimeter and energetic grid line screens in set position. All right. Woo! Okay, so pattern lines and high calculation lines, a computer operated line surface has 1 ground into oscillogic panels into alpha, delta, and theta. Now we change the correlation setting into green. Set communication of 0, 0, 0, 0, 0 in 1 set location. Okay, that's all set up. So we set a 0 line, the correlation track lines, we change back in black. Sets communication line screens into XT1000. Now the XT1000 platitudes division. Correlation line track interference is 0 correlation, sets communication line sending, set location. Direct modification solar sails, track position lines center, sets communication lines alpha, delta, theta, and omega set location of travel. Points lines of graph communication 1 signature, 1 pattern, 1 data location. Sets communication lines of center, communication lines interference, center correlated on line center interference, ionospheres, correlation spheres, direct line spheres, Millenian spheres, high calculation spheres, galactic spheres, mental spheres, line condition setting, mental capacity, calculation line interference, top position point graphs, spiritual line communication, point lines, high interference, all laws, emotional line track interference, torical fields, travel position point graphs, communication line interference, orbiting, tubing, line setting, high interference, optical line screen, high travel position point graphs, electrical line condition, CD-ROM centers, high interference, MKL line rotation centers, and travel point lines of graph communication of center. That's my equation. All right. Fractals over correlation lines of grounds is really understanding how positioned to its direct signals. Putting process of communication lines is a 31 setting. Triangulation line conditions of point lines of graph into nothingness. Set communication of nothingness, set location of lines of nothingness. 3 lines of high center interference. So we take the 3 tractions and 1 line division, 1 indicated cross line signals. Sets communication line interference of timestamp and set location of travel. Point lines of high interference. Sets communication line interference in position of 3 centers and travel. So we set up the 3 lines of mountains in line condition setting, 0 gravity, alpha, set lines of delta, set location of beta, sets communication line interference and 12 line signal, equals lines of graph, communication lines of DNA travel, point lines of high center interference, center core system and travel point line graph communication. Now direct lines of modification center is the center core settings of travel. Points lines of graph communication lines is the ground lines of travel. Points lines higher interference is the center core system of travel. Point lines of graphing is the center position operation line connections of travel. Second line communication orbiting, atom, line rotation, molecule, photon, electron, neutron, high calculation box lines, alpha, mega, micro, macro. Direct lines of data, force, line interference, high position back to nothingness attraction. That's my equation. All right. So the alpha, delta, line, theta, line rotation interference, your center core setting your 7 lines, your waving cycles, correlation lines, your atmospheres, your connections to all the high position locations, nothing. Woo! All right, so calculate line interference comes in, all line communication setting to stratosphere, biosphere, and calculations of radiosphere. Now the line communication line interference has alpha line tone, says communicate delta, theta communication operation cycles. Generation screen interference is nothing in position of travels, point lines of graph, communication lines of nothingness. Center communication lines of self-awareness, self-consciously and position of consciously of its awareness. Set position of 3 zeros, and set position of all levels energetic pattern, says communication line of diffusion. Vega command centers at 3-track division, 3 line cycles, and 3 generation screens. Direct modification lines of center, correlation settings of platform 1, travel cross line signals of platform 2, sets communication line centers, balance position location line centers, 8-track division, north, east, west, and south, and the diamond core line rotation, surface, and traction. That's my equation. All right. The center communication line center to the VR system is really understanding how positioned to its tone center. Now I've got a VR line rotation into a 27 value. Sets communication line centers, set position of 6 equals lines of calculation box. Box triangulation, sets communication lines of platforms. Towers of communication lines of 3 line cycles. Teleportation wave, telecommunication, telegraphing. 3 line cycles of generation line, connecting high center appearance. Sets position of water containment. Dots on the dotted lines of 0, 0, and communication line provision, 2 centers into 3 communication. Right, that's my equation. All right, so the water containment screen line is already an allocate frame lines. That puts position of platforms at 144 travel, point lines of travel, direct lines of modification line, connection setting, and position of its operation system. Point lines of graph communication of data highway is already set in correlation setting and 12 line connection setting. So you got 1, 2, 3 of docking, set position of 5, 6 lines of 7, 8 setting correlation lines of 9, 10, and 11, and 12 set locations and travel position operation. Now we're done. Okay? Ha! You're going to have to drink your water for that one, I'll tell you. It's amazing what just happened now in position location to your settings to your flames and your location setting to your vehicles. It's all in correlation to balance now. All right, so all lines of your atmospheres. 5 have your screen lines, correlation setting, your atmospheres, hemispheres, stratospheres, biospheres, and radiospheres, all back to nothingness. All right, so it's travel track vision. We're on the center correlation setting, way down signal, and position of 24 million lines years, 144 track position of center. We're in the crystal grid now, guys. Okay, no more 24, 48, 72. We're in the center core system and set lines of 24 waiting on signal, equal lines of correlation setting equal 144 track line, position line, community setting, and travel point lines. But the position location of 24 million is a 24 clocking of northwest, south, and east and travel calculations. Hoo-ah. Okay? So 24 of everything, isn't it? Balance position of your intersections and correlation lines of attractions in all 3 set locations. Now, understanding your data highways is understanding the position location to its settings, how it comes in that track locations. Understanding the directions of the center lines of its platforms and the 4 set locations and calculations. Hoo-ah. Okay? That's how it's going to be set up. So we got a Monday line screen, Tuesday line rotation, and Wednesday. It calculates on Thursday and a Friday set lines of a split, null lines, and anomaly. 3 communication lines of 1 split and 3 track location provision. Center lines of pi, clock lines, centers, and line rotations of northwest, south, and east, and a 24 angle, 24 lines of north, 24 lines of east and west, and 24 line calculated setting in a 140 graph, equals lines correlation setting in a 24 million cycle, and calculating line sense at 24 million years, in a line setting high interference into the VR system, equals lines of nothing and track locations. Hoo-ah. Now we're done. Woo! How's everybody feel? See you in 5.